let's talk about the funding overview in Canada. So essentially, when we look at the Canadian landscape, the question I often get is, how should we be setting ourselves up? What's the idea? And obviously, IQ is your first, sort of go-to when you're thinking about coming to Canada. But once you get set up, there's a few things that you can do sort of strategically to be set up well for funding. And one of those is, ideally you're looking at incorporation in Canada. Preferably is what we call a CCPC, which is a private corporation as opposed to a subsidy of a foreign entity like an Indian company. You can still take advantage of programs. We find that, when you're a Canadian company, separated Canadian company, there are more advantages, right? With programs in Canada, there are specific requirements. So, I've heard about some of the programs in India as an example where, I guess the third point there is really talking about, there's like a seed type of funding that startup. Canada is a little bit different in that regard. It tends to be categorized, and we'll talk about that as we go through the presentation, but it tends to be categorized by different, areas of funding. And they tend to not say, well, here's a pool of money that you can do anything with. It tends to be, again, more based on different categories. So with that in mind, some programs do have specific requirements, right? So you might have programs that look at certain revenues or certain amount of employees, or certain growth. So there are some programs that are easier to access when you first get started, and some that are definitely further down the line. So just to be completely transparent, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that every single grant is available for everyone as soon as you start, right? So just to kind of set that stage, as you evolve as a company, definitely there's going to be more and more things that become applicable. But just, as it would be in any category. There are kind of two types of main programs that we'll talk about today. So I'll start with tax credits, which is the big tax credit program is what we call SR&ED or SR&ED. You might have heard of it that way. And then grants. So grants, again, are your direct funding programs, right? So these are programs that you're given money in advance of doing something. And so talk about the differences between those two as we go forward. And I just in general, what we do, where we fit in, we help with all of those types of programs. We have a group. So I lead a group that's dedicated to funding. Essentially, we're part of our tax group at Grant Thornton. We have grant writers on our team. We have people that are specialists in technical and on the accounting side. So even though we're an accounting firm, we're quite interesting in that we have engineering folks on our team, engineering background, I should say. So depending on the type of company, we're very agnostic, right? So I've got everything from blockchain, crypto. I've got a client that's in pet food. I've got clients in manufacturing. I've got food, pharmaceutical. We even have medical doctors that are practicing in Canada that are doing research. They can take advantage of SR&ED as an example, right? So it's very, very broad. So it's not just, even though my background comes from technology, really, as long as you meet the criteria of these different programs, there's no restriction. Any company, and I'm assuming we have a wide range as well today on the call. You're not really restricted. The categorization, the specific requirements apply broadly across the industry.
And thank you. Sorry, Naren, I have next question actually ready for you before you go into the. So thank you so much for putting it clear in perspective that if you are coming to Canada and you want to launch a business and access funding, you need to have a legal entity in Canada. And what I can see from the screen you're selling is that it's better to have a Canadian controlled private corporation. And correct. When you were giving introduction to that budget is supporting us and that there is more funding coming, I heard a very buzzword, which everybody over the years asked me, what are SR&ED credits? I think so that attracts massively companies into the Canadian market, which is very, very unique to our tax system and government support. So before you get into segue and get into the flow, I think so we should just start with what are tax credit? What are the indicators for these SR&ED credits? And how one is eligible? What is the eligibility criteria? So if you can take that for us first, then we can go into details of the other aspects.
Yeah, for sure. And so, let me start with generally what tax credits are. So, and Canada in general, if you are familiar, in India, they would have tax credits and the Canadian program stacks up quite favorably. And I have worked a little bit in the US program as well and the UK, but Canada's program is one of the best in the world when it comes to, being lucrative and rewarding companies for doing R&D. And essentially a tax credit, you can think of it as basically a reduction on your expenditures in R&D. So essentially any R&D that's occurring in Canada. So that's an important qualifier as well. I do have a lot of clients that do still have some work that's outsourced and that sort of thing, like to India and other countries. that sort of work doesn't qualify under the program. But essentially anything that you're doing in Canada from an R&D perspective, every year when you're filing your corporate tax return, so as a company, that's established in Canada, you have to file a tax return or a T2. You can basically file a tax credit application to basically subsidize or recoup some of the money that you have spent on R&D through the tax system. And we'll get into some of the calculations and things like that later, but the idea is that it's a very, very lucrative program because a lot of the costs, and their main categories are, all of the employees that you're paying, any contractors that you're paying in Canada, any materials that you might be purchasing for R&D, any collaborations that you might be doing with different universities and research institutions. All of those things could potentially count towards your R&D claim. So you're talking about a lot of potential expenditure that you can put through this program to recoup. Really, then it gives you more runway, right? So the idea is, especially as a startup, the idea is you want to continue to invest, you want to continue to do R&D, you want to continue to subsidize and have a way of funding this work in Canada. And obviously, nowadays with salaries and things like that are increasing, you want to have a program like this in place, to take advantage of a program like this in place, because again, it can substantially reduce the amount that you're going to have to pay, essentially lay out. And when you're looking at something like salary, and we'll get into a calculation later, you can be looking at up to about 60% as a return, right? So when you think about something like that, that's quite staggering, and something that you want to definitely take advantage of and set yourself up to take advantage of. So in Canada, the program is called SR&ED, and it stands for Scientific Research and Experimental Development. Again, it's Canada's largest program to promote assisted industrial R&D. It's supported by both federal and provincial governments. So depending on where you're going to be set up, obviously we're Ontario focused today, but this program is broadly across Canada. Everyone gets access to the federal credit, and then every province, depending on where you are, has an additional component, right? So every province has a sort of a kick in as well. Some of these numbers are sort of changing, but roughly $3.5 billion are given out in tax credits each year. Average claim size is about 150,000. Which what that tells me, or should indicate, is that this program, the sweet spot of this program, is really for startups and small, medium-sized companies. So while the big players, companies, in Canada, think about like, Bell Canada and some, it used to be BlackBerry, but some of the bigger companies do take advantage of these programs for sure. But it's not really the sweet spot, and the reason for that is they want to focus and really provide more incentive to early stage companies, because those are the companies that really need this type of benefit to continue to operate, and like I said, continue to function, right, and continue to do R&D in Canada. There's kind of three criteria, and we'll kind of go through this and in terms of what qualifies. So there's a very specific definition of R&D, and you think of R&D, you might think of a subset of you might be looking at certain specific activities or something in your mind, and you think of R&D as a certain connotation. Canada has a very specific definition of what R&D is in the context of SR&ED, and essentially there's kind of three things, and the first one is the most important, is what we call technological or scientific uncertainty. So the idea there is, and we'll get into each of these a little bit further, but essentially there has to be some level of, I always look at it as a risk. There has to be some level of unknown, or some sort of uncertainty, again, that you have to resolve. So the idea is not something that you know how to do, or you previously know how to have done, or is publicly known. There has to be some element of unknown in what you're trying to accomplish. Then there's an element of systematic investigation, which we'll talk about in a second. And then technological or scientific advancement. So the idea is that you are learning something. I always look at this third one as kind of your secret sauce, right? So what new concept, new process, new advancement, what are you bringing to the Canadian market? That's what the government is looking for. They want to know, they want to understand what it is specifically that you're doing. And, as a good example I always use is, the question I always get is, well, like, okay, let's say we were starting a company that's in the search engine space, right? So obviously Google is out there. Google is a big player. Are we precluded, as an example, from doing a claim as a search engine company? I'm using search engine. You could substitute search engine with whatever type of company you want. Are we precluded from doing a claim like that in R&D? And the answer is no, just because the way this program works is you can certainly have competitors, as long as the know-how or how they're doing it is not publicly known, it's not in the public domain and is proprietary, you can still take advantage of the program. The way you're judged is on your own knowledge base level, right? So they look at each company and say, okay, what does this company know do they look into, what's in the public domain and see what's available? Absolutely. Like, nowadays, it's everything is accessible through Google and searching and all of that. But you're not precluded from doing that. And at the same time, it's incremental knowledge. So you don't suddenly have to, the question I get sometimes is, do I have to suddenly invent a new language? I have to come up with something that's never been done before? No, not necessarily, right? The government is not asking you to do that either. They're not asking you to come up with the equivalent to Java or some sort of programming language that's never been done before. It's about incremental knowledge gain. So the idea is you can be leveraging things that are already there. Nobody wants to reinvent the wheel, but there has to be something that we can show that you're doing above and beyond, right? So there's something, it could be minor, it could be an improvement, it could be an enhancement, it could be something in your industry. Maybe you're taking something from one industry and bringing it to another. There's lots of different ways to position a project. So that's when you keep this program in mind. You certainly, sometimes I like to say it's a bit of an art more than a science, in some ways. It's how you capture or characterize or describe the work that you're doing to fit the criteria. So that is as important, I would say, in this program, because a lot of times you might be doing work that qualifies and not really even know it. So something to keep in mind for SR&ED. So kind of touched on these things already, but there's some nice visuals here. So in terms of, okay, so developing something new. So yeah, question I always get is, okay, how do I know if I qualify, right? So yeah, are you developing something new or making incremental improvements to it? So I kind of touched on this already. Are you improving functionality, quality, cost, cycle time? So are you doing something now that the others, it was very slow before, you're able to do it a lot faster, you're able to do it, improve the functionality and reduce the cost? All these things could be indicators that you're coming up with something that is innovative in some way. And are you better at something today than you were in the past? So that's something that I talk about, could be the focus of your SR&ED project. So yeah, so systematic investigation. Again, if a lot of you are familiar with the scientific method, this program is really rooted in underlying scientific method. So it's a very technical program. So another important aspect of the program is there's a difference between sort of the underlying science and the business side. This program is really concerned with making advancements in science and technology. Honestly, it doesn't really matter with SR&ED if you're successful ultimately. Think about this program as a pure R&D play, right? So the idea is you're spending a lot of money to try something, right? And the government is going to sort of essentially reward you for trying. So it doesn't matter if you're successful. To be honest, like the trials that you have, the learnings that you've made, anything that hasn't worked, failed attempts, all of those things count, right? So it's not, you could have spent a lot of money on something and ultimately it didn't get off the ground. You could still get a SR&ED credit for that, right? Because they are interested in what attempts are you trying to make to do something and bring something to market. It's not a requirement that you bring something to market. So the idea is your hypothesis, you're coming up with new ideas. Again, ideas that are not routine or straightforward for somebody in your industry. Ideas don't have to succeed. Again, failure is okay. And the advancement has to be field in the science, has to be in the field of science or technology. So there's a long list of, everything from, I've got, like I was mentioning earlier, we've got everything from, software, aerospace, manufacturing, food and beverage. And if somebody's interested, I can send you the list. There is a very, very broad range of categories for you to fit your particular project. So it's, it's not restricted to a few. It's very specific. So, everything, again, like I said, we have a client that's in marine technology. They're actually using technology to assess wave heights in the ocean, right? Just as it's very, very interesting work. Fits under marine engineering. It's really broad. So the idea is, as long as you're making advancements in a specific industry, you can be taking advantage. So I've kind of again touched on this again. So it's uncertainty, coming up with new ideas. Consistent work is consistent with the scientific method, right? So the idea is, here's an idea, I developed something, I test it, did it work? No. Go back to the drawing board, do it again. You kind of repeat that cycle, and were detailed records kept. So this is another very, very important thing that I'll kind of touch on as we go. But this program, it's mentioned in the last point, is administered by the CRA, which is Canada Revenue Agency. So just like any of your other tax, your personal tax, your corporate tax, your HST filings, all of that is administered by it's the same. It's a different department of the CRA than your other tax departments, but similar in that sense is that they are the ones looking at these claims. So
Perfect.
Yeah, and then
Sure. Go ahead. I have my next question. Otherwise, ready for you.
Another nice little visual here for everyone. So, just to kind of paint the picture again about what SR&ED is visually, right? So you're starting your base level is here's where the company is now. The target level is where we're trying to get to. The green semicircle is basically showing you all the constraints. Here are all the challenges, and here are all the problems that we're going to face. SR&ED is the squiggly arrows, essentially. How are we going to get around these problems with innovative new ideas? We're bringing new ideas to the Canadian market that haven't been really done before. That's essentially what it is. So that's the easiest way to think about SR&ED is what are the new ideas that I'm bringing that potentially could solve the problems that I'm facing and eventually lead to commercialization. Whether or not it gets there, that's fine.
Okay. So Naren, on that note, that it's a potential idea. And as you said, what it is focusing is less on business, but more on research and development. And you said that we would need to take the evidence of all the research. So does that mean that every founder has to wear a white lab coat? And because whenever you think about research and get into a lab, like where the rats are being dissected, or maybe where the software is being developed, put a lab coat, get it inside and ask everyone, hey, take my pictures from every angle. So here is the documentation, I'm doing it. So my question is what is R&D here? What will we define as R&D, and what kind of work they need to do to be eligible for that, and what kind of documentations they should be keeping at the same time. So when they come to consultants like you who can help them apply for certain credits, you're not saying, okay, guys, I know you did this, but show me how. So how do you take care of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the idea with SR&ED.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry, I think so. One of these.
No, that's a great question. There is this connotation sometimes when you hear the term R&D. You think about chemists in a lab or in a science lab, and you're doing this cutting edge stuff that no one else is doing, and you're in a room, and that's all you're involved with. No, so the program is broad. So I kind of touched on this in a few ways already, but obviously we do have some clients like that in our portfolio. Like the idea is they're doing medical research, they're producing journal papers, patents, and that's all they're doing. Vast majority of our clients fit under the ED of SR&ED, which is experimental development, and their goal is to go to market, right? The idea that most companies, you're in this for profit, you're trying to develop something new, you're trying to create new jobs, and so that's not it at all. And so the idea is, and I think I kind of mentioned this earlier, so we've got a broad range of clients doing in all sorts of industries. The common factor between everybody is it kind of fits this approach of the scientific method. So the idea is, again, that you have identified a problem, right? So there's a problem statement. There's something, a gap in the Canadian market for something. I'll give you an example. So we've got a number of clients now based out of what we call the legal innovation zone here in Canada. So the idea is, and this was all new to me a few years ago, they're developing technology to improve legal processes. So as an example, there's a company that's doing wills now entirely online. So this was something that would have been unheard of years ago, right? When you think about legal processes, well, probably some of the most manual type processes where you have to deal with a lawyer directly, you have to go into a lawyer's office. Now there's an entire sector called legal tech. So the idea is what they're doing is taking these manual processes and automating them, right? So I've got a client that's doing wills. I've got a client that's doing these massive court documents and using AI and machine learning to analyze this type of documentation. Again, this is something, I can talk about AI, that's a whole different conversation. It's something that you would not even have thought about years ago, but because of the power of things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, you're able to take industries that were traditionally very manual and be able to now automate and apply technology to them. That sort of stuff has qualified for SR&ED, and that's not something that's completely the other end of something you would think about in a lab coat environment. So just to give you an example, right, of how broad the program can be. So, but again, they are fitting this category, right? And so to your other point, Upasana, just about what can we claim. So what does SR&ED include? Typically, SR&ED includes everything on the left. So engineering, design, operations research, mathematical analysis, computer programming, data collection, testing, and psychological research. What it really doesn't capture, and some grants do, and we can talk about that in a bit, but SR&ED really doesn't really focus on market research or sales promotion, quality, routine testing, social science, humanities research, prospecting. I don't know if anyone here is involved in that industry, drilling, oil, that sort of thing. Commercial production, I've kind of touched on this already. Commercial use of a new product, style changes, routine data collection. So what this really, I don't think I have the slide here, but basically what this is trying to show is SR&ED is not just, hey, I've come up with this cool new machine learning concept, right? And this is my core advancement. You can expand the claim to include a lot of the other activities. So I have come up with this, but I need to come up with ideas. I need to code it. I need to test it. I need somebody to manage the project around this. You can expand your circle of what you can claim under the SR&ED program. So then it becomes not just the one person that came up with this great idea. You have a whole team, right? Potentially that's involved with doing all of this work. So suddenly the costs that you're looking to claim can expand substantially, right? Because again, it's not on this slide, but a question I got, a good example for this is, let's say your R&D is really focused on a new wing design for an airplane, right? So you've come up with this new design, aerodynamic design. How am I going to test this design? Well, don't I have to build an airplane, right? Don't I have to actually validate this with an airplane to actually validate that my wing design is working? That design of the airplane on its own is not SR&ED, but as part of this project, it's what we call support work. I need to have that built in order to validate this wing design. That's the kind of the power of the program, in the sense that you can expand the scope of what activities you can claim. So it gets very interesting, as long as it's again focused on the things on the left side of the screen. I think, was there and then I guess I can get into the clock. Yeah,
there's actually a question from the audience here. The question is, does SaaS qualify for a SR&ED?
SaaS was the question, right? Software as a service.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a number of SaaS clients. So, at the end of the day, SR&ED is not so much concerned with whether you're producing software. And, to be honest, nowadays, cloud SaaS is kind of the model, right, for software delivery. So yes, absolutely. A lot of my clients are in that space. And it depends on kind of what the, innovation is that you're doing. So at the end of the day, the delivery itself of how you're selling your product doesn't matter. We have a lot of innovative clients that are doing work in the SaaS space, for sure.
Sure. I have one question for you, but before I jump into it, I see we have a question from Akash in the thing. Please elaborate on the difference between STU and commercial and technical advancement. If you want to take it now or you want to take it later, you let me know.
I can take it now. Yeah. So a commercial, so when we look at commercial for SR&ED, sometimes it's a fine line, to be sure. So what happens is, you go through, usually how a project works, an R&D project or a company project, you do a bit of analysis, right? You do some surveys, you do some, you do some market research to see, hey, like, is there a need for something like this? Is there, what does the industry look like? Then you get into your project, you actually do your research, your investigation, your experimentation, your analysis, your testing, all of that work. Then at the end of that, hopefully you've come up with a product that you can take to market. So the idea is SR&ED kind of stops once that happens. Once you're ready to take your product to commercial, and it's commercially viable, unless, I'll give you an example. Sometimes, you've done all your work, in the lab, and internally, you go to take your product and you realize that at the scale that you're going to be doing this thing commercially, all sorts of new problems are introduced, right? So you can't properly, talk about alpha testing, beta testing. There could be further R&D for sure, right? When you get it into the field, like you realize, like, oh my God, like I didn't think about this. One example we had, I think years ago, might have been before Uber, but you think about like simulating like a taxi software, right? The idea to do that internally through a simulation versus, actually getting it out in the field and testing this thing out. I'm sure all major companies had sort of this type of issue. There might be further R&D. But generally speaking, once it's in a state where it's kind of ready for commercialization, and then you're just making style changes, you're doing the marketing, it's in a different state. That is kind of where SR&ED stops off. So the technological advancement is really the new knowledge that I've generated for my company. This is my new algorithm. This is my new process that I've developed. This is my new formulation for pet food that I've come up with. Once it's the commercial advancement is after that, right? So that is ultimately my product. So SR&ED is not really concerned with the product So, it's really the underlying science behind it. Think of it as like what's under the hood of the car. It's not the car itself. It's the new science, the new knowledge that you've generated. The product or the commercial advancement is putting all those pieces together and packaging it up and bundling it and selling it. And that's kind of the distinction. So.
Perfect. I think so. Now you have given a very succinct, because we are running all sort of time, you've given a very succinct idea about what shred credits are, who is eligible, what is included. So I have all the ingredients to make the pie, and I'm going to talk about meat in the pie, or for our vegetarian friends on the call, apples in the pie. How much money do you get in shred credits? I could be eligible. I could be doing this thing. How much money do I get back, and how do you quantify that? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, excellent question. So when we talk about, I kind of alluded to it earlier. So there's a number of different expenditures that are allowable under the program. So obviously you want to know, what the materiality is, and is this kind of something that's worth doing? So there's kind of 4 categories. There's 3 indicated here on the screen, but the third, I'll talk about the 4th one. But the biggest bucket is always salaries and wages. So if you're a Canadian company, you're paying your employees. It's what we call a T4. You're issued a T4 each year as an employee. Those salaries for those people that are doing the R&D in Canada is kind of your big bucket for an expenditure. But contractors are also allowed. Now, contractors do also have to be Canadian, but the difference between a contractor and a salaried individual is usually that what happens is they're paid via invoices, and you're not doing the source deductions. So I don't know how many on the call are familiar with the taxation system in Canada, but you've got your CPP and EI deductions that are taken out at the source. So the big difference is, you're just basically paying this very specialized person. So contractors are usually used in that case. So I need an Android programmer. So I'm gonna go. I don't have somebody in house. I don't want to hire a full-time employee. I could go to an agency. I could go to there's a lot of these software development shops. I'm using software as an example. It could be any industry, and I'm getting a specialist person just to do this development for me, and I'm going to pay them as a contractor. They're going to issue invoices, and I'm going to pay them. And they're not employees of my company. So there's that. And then materials. So materials in SR&ED is really, there's a difference between material and capital. So I want to talk about that here. So capital is something that I'm going to be reusing in my project. For example, years ago in the program, they used to allow laptops and servers and different things that I'm going to be reusing over and over in my project. Even things like AWS hosting costs and those types of things, they don't really qualify anymore. But a material would be, hey, I'm building this prototype. I have to buy all these parts, and I'm going to have to try all these different things, and they're going to be scrapped, right? So it's either something that's consumed or transformed or forms the body of the thing that I'm building, right? So think about it like that. And materials, the nice thing is, they can be sourced from anywhere. So it doesn't have to be from Canada. So if I have to get special parts from China, from India, from the US, whatever it is, that's totally fine, as long as it's part of my, in the R&D process. That's what we call a SR&ED material. The 4th category, I'll quickly talk about it. I know I want to spend some time on grants as well, is under, similar to contractors, is what we call third-party payment. So let's say I have a special project and I need a very special set of skills from a research institute or a university. It could be University of Toronto, could be anywhere. I want to get let's say a professor, maybe some students involved from a program as part of my R&D project. I pay them some money. They go off and do some research. I'm not necessarily supervising that research, but I'm able to exploit the results of that research. So they've produced some information that I can use as part of my project. I can also potentially claim that under the SR&ED program. And actually in Canada, there are programs called, I don't know if people are familiar with My Tax and different types of grant programs. What's really nice is it could be part of a My Tax program where my company is putting in some money. My Tax is matching that contribution. The money that I'm putting in as a company, I can potentially put that through the SR&ED program as well. So there's that nice sort of almost double benefit in a way, right? So we're stacking programs, but yeah, so those are the categories. And so obviously everybody wants to know, like, what does this kind of look like in terms of what this credit would look like. So let's do a simple sort of calculation for you. So let's say directly engaged wages was 100,000, so ballpark number. So those are salaries. Contractors, 25,000. So external people that I've hired to do some work for me, $10,000 in materials. So one of the very, very really nice things about the SR&ED program is there is an overhead amount that's given to companies. So I talked earlier about, you may have a lot of things that do not fall necessarily under the SR&ED program. for example, like some of your administrative costs, your overhead, your utilities, your travel. What the government actually does is they give you a nominal 55% markup on your salaries. So for your 100,000, it actually gets bumped up by 55,000 automatically. So you don't have to have receipts to prove any of this. You don't have to do anything. It's just an automatic bump up that they give you for overhead. So your 100,000 actually becomes 155,000. So that's really the power of salaries versus contractors, is you're given quite a bit of a substantial bump up. Contractors are actually reduced by 80%. So you're actually taking only 80% of the value. So that 25,000 becomes 20,000. Your materials are 1-to-1, so same 10,000. So what happens is you add up those expenditures. So based on a spend of 135, my expenditure pool is actually $185,000 now because of that bump up. I'm going to use rough numbers here. So everybody federally, there's a 35%. I'm using Ontario here as an example. It's about 8.5% in Ontario. So remember I talked earlier about federal and provincial. So you've got 35% federally. Every province has a bit of a kick in. Roughly in Ontario, you're looking at 8%. So that credit works out to about $80,000. That $80,000 is whatever you want to do with it. Now, so if you're a company that's taxable, which means you owe tax in Canada, that number is going to reduce your tax bill first. If you're not taxable, it's actually cash that's coming back to you, assuming you're a Canadian company, right? That I talked about earlier. So yeah, so it's quite lucrative in terms of the return that you can get. So before we shift over to grants, were there any other questions on the SR&ED program?
Yes, I have one question in the chat. So I think it's from SK. It's initial there. Will we get tax credits that would be adjusted with subsequent returns or cash refunds assured, assuming the startup has no net income in the first couple of years? So what I'm saying is, like, if I'm getting a tax credit today of, say, SR&ED credit of $100 today, and in 2 years later I had an income of 200 and I was getting, will that be done? And then after this I have another question from Sandeep, but if you can take care of this one first.
Yeah, if I'm understanding the question, does one claim year impact kind of a subsequent year in that regard? No. So the idea is you can claim SR&ED every year. Every year is independent of subsequent years. So, this first year I may have a small amount of expenditure and no revenue. I'll get this credit. Next year, my R&D goes way up. I could get a larger refund. In the third year, again, my R&D continues to go up, but then I start generating revenue. So what will happen is the credits will then offset the taxes that I potentially have to pay, but then I'll still be getting a refund. So yeah, it's as the CRA approves one claim year, that's it. So that it's independent of subsequent years.
Perfect. I have a question from Rebecca. She's from South Africa, a very driven entrepreneur who have had opportunity to work with. And her question is, can the cost of transporting the material consumed be claimed? For example, can the entire cost of acquiring the material can be claimed for SR&ED credits? So she's into food and beverage industry.
Yeah, for sure. As part of that material cost that I mentioned, we can include the transport costs as well. So we have seen that in some of our claims, where you're bringing in materials from a different country, and you have to source the materials and bring them in. Yeah, so that's typically something that is allowable under the materials category.
Okay, then I have a question from Sandeep, and I will add on to mine too. So for his question is, does salaries paid to overseas employees could be claimed? So you have hired some programmers outside Canada, for example, and you're paying them, they're on your payroll. So will that be included as well?
No. So unfortunately, I think I've mentioned this earlier on, but no, outside of Canada, costs don't qualify. Now, where we're getting into a bit of a gray area, especially during the pandemic, is we saw a lot of people working remotely. So the way the CRA kind of looks at it is Canadian taxpayers. So depending on your status, and I think PR status, or as long as you're a taxpayer in Canada. That's kind of what they look for. There is also an element, again, this is a bit of a more challenging concept now, where they kind of look to see where people are working. That is very difficult, but you look at the tax status more so than. So typically, no, you can't be hiring, for example, someone in India and claim SR&ED credits.
Okay, I have a question. So, for example, there are people who were doing a kind of a business and they see that there is a problem in their business which could be solved with automation. Am I right? If they bring a software, so they understand the pain point and it is their experience, which is kind of an AI for this product to be developed, but they're not techies. So they go to a Canadian technology company and they retain the services of this Canadian technology company, which is going to develop the software for them. So my question is, now this is like you, when you gave the example was that you needed somebody specifically for Java and you hire that consultant. Now this company is basically developing a SaaS software, which they think they'll use for their own company and can give out in the future. But that is being developed by this technology company, which is working whom they have hired, and they are paying them as consultants to develop the tech. Now, the money they spend there, can that be considered SR&ED, that they can use that for SR&ED credits, or no? Because it's not like they didn't have any in-house tech expertise. They were hiring this company. So if you can just explain this example.
That's a great question. Just really, and what that comes down to is IP and who has the right to claim the SR&ED. So essentially, let's use in your example A and B, right? So A is the company that is developing the software, but they don't have any expertise. B is the company they're contracting. So A or B can claim SR&ED. The way the government looks at it is essentially who IP is a big one. So who owns the intellectual property, and is company B kind of doing this on their own and with no supervision? Is everything that they're generating their own? If that's the case, you might make a case that B could potentially claim SR&ED credits. Most of the time, though, my client being A, we are able to claim it. So the idea is A is paying B. A needs to develop the software, and exactly like you said, they don't have the in-house expertise to do it, so they pay B. That's totally fine. What we look for is that contract to be favorable. For A is to say, hey, like, we are paying this party, we retain everything that B is doing. So I've even seen contracts now where they explicitly mention the SR&ED program, where they say, the SR&ED credits are for company A. The idea for the government is they don't want double dipping, right? They don't want both parties to claim.
Sure. No, that helps. I have a question from Rohit. Rohit, I'm not sure about the question, but I'll just quickly take it because Naren is last going in 5 minutes, just take up a little bit about the grants. So he's saying, in case there is no tax payable, is this credit a cash handout to the startup to defray their cost? So I think that's going back to the actual meaning of SR&ED credits. Like, is it kick into only when you have tax payable, or you have no revenue, no tax payable, you can still get money from the government?
It is actually cash. So a lot of my clients, given that they're startup, are pre-revenue. So I sometimes say I'm operating kind of a not-for-profit in a way, because essentially what's happening is it could be a while before companies are revenue generating. But that's the entire premise behind the SR&ED program, is to support you during that time. Is the idea is, hey, you're doing some very interesting work. The Canadian government wants to recognize that, subsidize a portion of those costs, so then you can continue to operate until you're revenue generating. The one caveat, and I touched on it right from the beginning, is you'll need to be set up as a Canadian-controlled private corporation in order to take advantage of cash credits. I have some companies that are not. I have some large U.S. entities that set up R&D centers in Canada. They don't benefit from cash credits. They only benefit as tax once they're taxable in Canada if you're set up as a subsidiary of an international company. Still could be very valuable. And the credits are pooled for like 20 years. So let's say you're in that situation and you're thinking, like, does it make sense for me to do SR&ED? It still could, because they sit there in a pool, and then eventually if you become taxable, you can use them. But if you're a CCPC and you're not taxable, yeah, absolutely, that's cash credits. I'd say the majority of my clients fit into that bucket.
No, I think so. This could be one of the crispiest, shortest crash course on something as complex as SR&D credits. So anybody who have more questions on it will be more than happy to answer in the future. And I think so, considering how many people registered for this, we might have to get Naren back. But Naren, as we are wrapping up in next 5 minutes, my next question is, we were talking about government grants, but SR&ED is such a big topic that we focused on that. Before going, if you can tell us, what is the difference between a grant and a tax credit? And then we can take up grants next time with you. But what is the difference between the two? Are they the same, or what is this gameplay?
Yeah, probably have to do an even quicker crash course in grants today. But essentially, so everything I've been talking about, tax credits, SR&ED is the big one. There are digital media tax credits and other tax credits, but the big difference is tax credits are, I'm spending some money. Once I've spent the money, I'm going to get some of it back. Grants are, I want to do something, give me some money before I start to do it. That's the difference. So it's when the money is essentially given to you. So I guess in the interest of time, I'll kind of talk about the landscape of grants in Canada. So SR&ED is the big one for tax credit. Grants, there's a lot of different programs. So there's kind of 5 different categories that we see, business growth, innovation. So innovation comes up again. So there are sort of grant programs that are sort of similar to SR&ED, but on the grant side, international market expansion, workforce development, and agriculture. So I'll go back to the budget a few weeks ago. Again, in a big push for innovation, a lot of grant funding programs got refunded with more money. So it's a really good time, I would say, as well with grants. So they offer a range of programs to support businesses with project-based incentives. We get involved again with Grant Thornton. Our role is similar to the SR&ED applications, where we do everything for our clients. We again do everything for grants as well. We have grant writers on our team. So if any of you have familiarity with grants, again, it's sort of how you put the application together is very key. Some are very involved in terms of their writing, in terms of the type of information that they request. So you want to make sure you do grants properly, because that goes a long way in how you present yourself as a company and how you present your project to get funded and actually to get future funding. So I find a lot of companies that are successful in grants have done one, they get the next one, they build off of grants that they've done. Those are the companies that are really successful in grants, is that they're able to kind of leverage prior applications and additional funding. So maybe I'll maybe what I can do is I can kind of zip through here, but some of the sectors that they look at: advanced manufacturing, agriculture. Agriculture is a big push, to be honest. Right now, we're seeing a lot in agri-tech. I talked about legal tech earlier, but agri-tech is a big one. Obviously, fintech, but there are some very specific programs nowadays for companies. I have a very interesting client that's doing things in farming and developing software systems and hardware systems to figure out crops. And it's very interesting. ICT, obviously, aerospace, biotech, pharma. I want to highlight this. Sometimes on the flip side, kind of what we don't see grants covering usually are things like working capital, mergers and acquisitions, debt, construction, purchasing land and buildings. There are other avenues for this, and I can do probably another presentation on just other sources of funding in Canada that kind of go beyond what we do. There's obviously BDC and the banks, and there's a whole avenue, and that's another conversation for another day. But typically the government grants don't cover this. Kind of talked about this as well. How do we help? We monitor the grant landscape. So I think one other thing I want to highlight for grants is while SR&ED is fairly standard in the sense that every year companies file SR&ED claims with their tax return, it doesn't really change. I mean, there have been changes over the years. Grants vary a lot, because what happens is I could have a grant come in for a 4-week intake, right? And then the agency runs out of money, or they're saying they don't take any applications anymore. The grant landscape in Canada is very dynamic, right? In that sense. So if federal budget comes around, a bunch of these programs get money. In 6 months, they may be out of money. So what we do, we all are always looking to see what's changing, what's new, what's added. So you have to kind of stay on top of it, right? And so that's very important, because if you don't know what's available, it's very hard to apply. So there's a lot of different things that we do in the grant landscape. Maybe what I can do, we can definitely share this slide, and maybe we can do a subsequent session on grants. But
sure,
there's a few programs that are highlighted. There's one other thing. What I was doing here was just highlighting some example programs from each of the categories. There's one link I do want to highlight for everyone, which is a really, really good resource that I would highly recommend everybody take a look at. It's a link here. Essentially, it's what we call the Business Benefits Finder. So I talked about Canada's push for innovation. They've set up this portal where anybody can go in, and actually our team uses this as well, where you can go in and do this query on funding. And it's very broad. It asks you about where you are, how many employees, what industry, and it spits out all the potential programs that are available. Very, very good resource, especially if you're kind of new to the space. So what I would do is I would take a look at this link. It's something that I can even paste in the chat for everybody. But this is a great starting point for, particularly for grants, just because there's so many. So that was a quick crash course on the grants side. I don't know if there's any follow-up questions there, but we can definitely do a follow-up session on that as well.
We will have to do, because we didn't do justice to the grants, because
No.
you know what, you spend money, you get it back is always good, but when you get free money, it's always better. So definitely we will have to come back to grants, but thank you so much for such valuable information. And I just wanted to shout out to Halim and Hiren, who are co-founders of a very potential promising EdTech, I would say, startup we are bringing to Canada. Please hear carefully, there is a lot of credits and grants for in the EdTech sector. We should be working on that and getting it done shortly. And health tech, Stuti, we are here. We should be working on that too. So on that note, Naren, thank you so much for this help. And just again, for those who don't know what IQ does, IQ helps startup gets launched, tax credits, grants, getting access to funding, positioning for the North American market, your go-to-market strategy, how to launch your sales, how to launch your other aspects, all is covered by IQ in what we do. We put ourselves as experts in startup visa as well, because before you come into Canada, you need to figure out how you're going to come into Canada. So startup visa is that answer for how, and then we help you to launch your business in Canada. We do it so that our goal is simple, our success rests in your success. And that's why we have these amazing professionals like Naren in our network who will be there to help you, support you to launch your company further. On that note, thank you so much. Shivi is going to start slowly a WhatsApp group where what you can do is we can have various needs of startups, what they're looking for, and we can bring professionals like Naren to come and answer those questions. Shred and grants were always on top. For last few days, I was hearing from a lot of my founders, okay, where do I start with grants? Come to us, we'll work together, get right help for you, and get this all going. On that note, thank you so much. It's still Wednesday today, so you have 3 more days to go on this week. Make good out of that. And we are looking forward to hearing from you. More questions, we are here to answer those questions in our Startup Corner series. Thank you so much, Naren. Really appreciate for your time and such a valuable information that you shared. Those who have missed it, we will definitely put this on our LinkedIn and other social media links, this recording in the future. So this valuable information, as long as many as people can get it and make use of it, that'll be great. Thank you so much, Naren. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and giving us a precious time.